Welcome everyone to today's Lead Generation Week session number 2. Hope you guys have been enjoying everything we've got going on this week. I want to, before we bring in our next presenter, I do want to make the typical housekeeping announcements, which is we want you to participate. Everybody watching and of course the presenters get a lot out of your questions. So there's a couple ways to do that. This may be a little repetitive for those that have been watching every session, but you can simply ask the questions within your mobile app or your desktop app there. There's a session Q&A. You can simply type them in there and we'll get them over to the presenter. Or you can simply click on the Q&A icon within Zoom and those questions will be visible to myself and the presenter as well. So go ahead, but please do ask questions. It definitely makes all these presentations much more valuable to everybody. So now without any further ado, I want to bring on Jon Kelly. Jon is the CEO of Kelly Klee Insurance and also the chairman of the board of directors for Hometown Quotes. Jon, welcome to Lead Generation Week, and I'll hand it over to you and let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate it, and appreciate having the opportunity, and welcome everybody to the meeting. Went ahead and shared my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. I wanted to just give a little bit of a preface. I've actually done a version of this presentation once before, about 10 years ago. And so I thought it'd be kind of an interesting time to do it again because, we are in a really strange and difficult situation right now. And, I thought it would be just appropriate to the timing. I'm going to be pretty open about things. This isn't, one of those things where we talk about, talk about bad things that have happened and just put a smiley, happy face on everything. I'm actually going to be pretty open about how things went. Okay, so the name of my session is Time Will Tell, Tales of Failure and Beyond. And I want to open it with a video. And the video is in some ways what inspired this. And this is a clip from a movie called Charlie Wilson's War about the Americans' initial engagements in Afghanistan. So I'm going to go ahead and play that clip.
There was a little boy, on his 14th birthday, he gets a horse. And everybody in the village says, how wonderful, the boy got a horse. And the Zen master says, we'll see. 2 years later, the boy falls off the horse, breaks his leg, and everybody in the village says, how terrible. And the Zen master says, we'll see. Then a war breaks out, and all the young men have to go off and fight, except the boy can't because his leg's all messed up. And everybody in the village says, how wonderful.
Now the Zen master says, we'll see.
So that's it, pretty short clip.
You get it.
I think the message there is pretty clear that when something good or something bad happens in my life, what I've kind of found after so many years and 25 years in business is that it's pretty unclear what that's going to mean and whether it's really going to be a good thing or a bad thing for me until sometimes many years down the road. So I want to start with, I mentioned in the description that I was going to tell 3 stories. So I wanted to start with the first story, and the first story is about my first company, and that company is eCoverage. eCoverage was one of the really first big aggressive insurance plays in the .com era. We were backed by some of the biggest and most active internet investors in the late 90s. I've listed them here. Company was backed by SoftBank and Excel, RRE Ventures, E-Trade, and eLoan. And really it was conceived by some of the folks at SoftBank as an answer to E-Trade and eLoan. In the mid and late 90s, both those companies had a tremendous amount of success with a direct, what now people are now calling a full stack model of selling loans, originating loans through eLoan, and doing stock trading through E-Trade. And at the time in 1998, when we started eCoverage, the insurance market, and this is kind of funny being at Lead Generation Week, the insurance market was really dominated by lead generation, to the extent that there were some early folks online like NetQuote and InsWeb. And so when we started eCoverage, it was really kind of an amazing, bold experiment. We raised a tremendous amount of money, and really with very little instruction. I remember the partner at SoftBank who funded us really kind of kept saying the same thing, which is, build me an online version of Geico. And of course, that was many years before Geico actually went online. But that's what we did. We set out to build an online version of Geico. And so we, we actually had quite a bit of success. I put it out, I actually copied here the article in Fortune about eCoverage in 1999. And you'll notice the date on it, which is October 11th of 1999. We'd raised a pretty substantial B round of funding, and we were just gearing up for our C round of funding. And so we hired a PR team, and we got press in Fortune and The Economist, and really some extraordinarily positive press. I think comparing us to Amazon was probably the absolute highlight for me. It didn't take long, though, before things turned around. So from October, just after that, we started raising money for eCoverage. And for those of you who were around at the time, a lot changed just 2 quarters later. On March 20th, Barron's Magazine put out an article, and the article was labeled on the cover with "Burning Fast." And what Barron's did was they actually went through all of the public, or many of the public internet companies at the time, and they looked at how much money those companies were losing, and they compared it to the cash that they had on their balance sheets. And the pretty obvious conclusion was that a huge percentage of internet companies would run out of money in a very short amount of time if they didn't raise a lot of money. Well, when this came out already we'd started to raise our Series C at the very end of December 1999, and really it started to meet with a lot of firms in Q1. We had Solomon Smith Barney, which was a major investment bank at the time, running a private placement for us. And I can remember even before this article came out, the VCs who sat on our board saying, we're hearing some really, really bad things. You guys need to really hurry and get this round done. And the article came out, and it was almost like a light switch had been switched off. I mean, it was that quick and that severe, where we went from David Riker and the CEO and I had gone from my co-founder had gone from meetings, taking calls, turning calls away, going meeting with people multiple times a week, to just really, really having a difficult time. What happened after that was interesting. Basically, the venture market entirely, completely dried up. And so our investors, they still wanted to see a good outcome for the company, and nobody really knows, as they always say, nobody knows what a recession looks like, and the bottom of a market looks like, until it's already passed, until it's already over. And so for a very long time, they stayed really, really hopeful. And they essentially gave us enough money to continue. We had 80 employees, by the way, on March 20th, 2000, 80 employees, and we're growing just like an absolute rocket ship. They gave us enough money to keep a reduced staff on board and to essentially pay the absolute essentials. So we paid for our servers, we paid to, anything that meant selling insurance policies and keeping insurance online, we continued to pay for, but we didn't pay our other creditors. And so for about a year, while we worked on getting a deal done, my job, of all things, was to call every one of our creditors, everybody that we owed money to, once a week, and basically tell them, what we were working, what we were trying to do, who we were talking to about fundraising or selling the company, what the progress was, to really just give them a report on what was going on, so they could get a sense as to when, if ever, they were going to get paid, because so many of them had offered trade credit, thinking that we were one of the top internet companies with major backers, and that it was just a blip and that we would get beyond it. One of the most difficult conversations that I had each week was with our advertising agency. And our advertising agency, and the reason why I put this image up here, our advertising agency was an agency called Secret Weapon, based in Santa Monica, California. And they were really just an amazing boutique advertising agency. They had done some iconic work. The managing director of the firm had written almost every one of the Energizer Bunny commercials after the very first one. They had done some iconic work for Porsche in North America. And most famously, when Jack in the Box had a tremendous problem I believe in the early 90s, Jack in the Box restaurants had an E. coli outbreak, and a number of people had actually gotten killed, a number of children had actually gotten killed from the E. coli outbreak. They launched a major public relations campaign and a new advertising campaign. And that advertising campaign was all conceived and written by the agency that eCoverage had worked with. And the fellow who was the director of the agency and wrote the ads also not only wrote the Jack in the Box ads, but he's the voice of Jack in the Box. So on these calls every week, the fellow that I was speaking to was the voice of Jack in the Box on the television commercials, and rightfully so. Again, he's a wonderful gentleman and an amazing guy, but rightfully so, we owed him quite a bit of money. That again, everybody doing the right thing. When we signed the contracts, we'd had funding from a major venture capitalist. We were well on our way to doing a Series C, a $50 million Series C. So we had no intention when we signed those contracts of not paying. We thought we were going to have a multi-year contract with them, but we owed him a substantial amount of money. And so every week for, gosh, I don't know, months and months and months, I had a call with the voice of Jack in the Box, and really, really difficult calls, because it was a lot of folks' personal money that we were unable to pay back. So it was a really hard time in 1999, for the rest of 99 and into 2000, and a lot of lessons from it. I think the major lessons that I got from it were, among other things, that it is really, really important, no matter who you're doing business with and what their situation is, to really think about trade credit. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The other lesson, as I get into part 2 with SureHits, is I became, after eCoverage ended and we sold it to General Motors in 2000, it was a deal that got some money back to the creditors, but it wasn't a deal that any of the investors or employees made any money from. One of the big lessons I got from the eCoverage experience was that doing business in a very, very expensive area like San Francisco, which is where eCoverage was headquartered, and spending a huge amount of money on rent and engineering resources and growing really, really fast, that's one way to do well, but it definitely is doing business on hard mode as they say in the gaming community. And so one of the things that I came away from with that experience was, gosh, I'm going to spend absolutely nothing. I'm building my next business, and I'm going to be profitable from the get-go. So the next business, after doing some consulting work, was a business called SureHits. And I've put up here, this is an actual Google Street View from 2020, by the way. So it actually looks quite a bit nicer than it did in 2000, in the early 2000s when we started SureHits. But this is the actual strip mall in Edmond, Oklahoma, where SureHits was located. I can't totally remember which of those office spaces it was, but it was long before they redid the parking lot. So it was it looked even quite a bit shabbier than that. So that was the SureHits World Headquarters in Edmond, Oklahoma. When we started SureHits in the early 2000s, I kind of knew just one thing. I had one thesis, one theory, which was I knew that people were going to want to do a lot of their insurance research and buying online. I'd seen that back in the eCoverage days. One funny story is that back in, I believe it was in 1999, we did one of the first ad buys on Google. We actually bought the #2 position for every keyword that included insurance at a $25 CPM, which was still kind of blows me away. So I knew that there was demand there, but we didn't know exactly how to harvest it when we started SureHits. And so the initial version of SureHits, and by the way, this is still live. And so a huge thank you and shout out to the folks at Quinn Street, because they've actually kept this site live, Next Insure. And so I took this screenshot just yesterday. But we started it off actually, one of the main things we were thinking was that it would be a direct-to-consumer website. And so we bought a domain, nextinsure.com, and we had these little, find an auto insurance, life insurance, and home insurance quote. The other major direction that we took, and again, just in how we were thinking about SureHits, the story of how SureHits came to be was that John Jones, the co-founder of SureHits, and I had been doing a lot of work with General Motors, with GMAC, after they bought eCoverage. And the initial idea was GMAC only did business in about 35 states. And they had actually asked us to find a way to show ads in the states they didn't do business in, so that they could make money from those states, because already in the mid 2000s, insurance advertising was very expensive online. So initially we had planned to show ads on insurance company websites that in the states they didn't do business, and to have a direct consumer offering via the site Next Insure. And unlike the first story where we ended up in essentially a failure mode, this story definitely has a happier ending, because even though the initial versions of this didn't really work out, we had a very difficult time generating much traffic for Next Insure. We actually were very early in the SEO game, and I think we got banned from Google once or twice for buying links. It took a while before we really figured out that ultimately we were a technology company, and that the key to SureHits was really, really focusing on the technology and focusing on having great relationships with the advertisers who use the technology, and with the affiliates, with the distribution partners. And as it turned out, insurance carriers like GMAC and our direct listings were a really, really small part of the success of SureHits. It turns out that almost all of the traffic came from third-party affiliates, from lead generators, like the folks, I think probably many of the folks who are on this call. And so we did have tremendous amount of struggle along the way, and pivots along the way as we kind of found our way towards a way to make it work through through our distribution through affiliates. So that's SureHits. The final story is probably the one that's going to seem the most strange given my background. So the end of SureHits for me really was, or the transitionary period was in 2008. In 2008, John Jones and I sold SureHits to Quinn Street, and that became the real foundation for the Quinn Street Insurance Division. I ran the Quinn Street Insurance Division from 2008 and 2000 to 2010, and really had an amazingly good amount of fortune there. Good fortune in the sense that all of the key members of the SureHits team stayed and were retained by Quinn, and then Quinn Street helped to bring in a really talented executive team. And so I was lucky enough in 2010 that I felt like I could step away, and I did step away. And the folks that took over and ran it from there really did an exceptional job. And I got my full earn out and the whole thing, and so that all went really well. In the meantime, after I essentially retired from the insurance business for a while, I had a non-compete, and I thought, this is in 2010, I started to see what was happening in social media. And I'd been on Twitter since 2007. I was early on Facebook, and I thought, social media is really going to take off, and I think there's something that I can do there to contribute. So, and I was kind of bored, just to be frank. And so I bought a domain, thisorthat.com, and I thought it would be fun to build a website where essentially people could compare anything. And so thus This or That was born. And that was our branding. We really, when we built the site, we built the technology, we had no idea what people would do with it. Literally the way it worked was it was user generated content. Users could upload anything they wanted to upload and make a comparison, and then send it to their friends, and people would comment on it and vote on it and that sort of thing. And so these are actually two comparisons that are very highly representative of the kind of content that we had on thisorthat.com. Two dogs on trampolines, which one is cuter? And then I would say a huge portion of all of the content that we had on thisorthat.com revolved around Justin Timberlake, and Bieber, of course. Sorry, and Bieber. This is the which Justin is cuter, this or that, this or that page. And like I said, Bieber, you can see looked quite a bit different there before all the tattoos and whatnot. The other thing, really, I can tell you, a tremendous part of our viewership on thisorthat.com was boy bands and kind of teenage heartthrobs. For whatever reason, a tremendous amount of our traffic was 13 to 15-year-old young ladies from Commonwealth countries. And so if there's some way that I could have bet on one direction in 2010, that would have made far more money than anything else I've ever done. So you see, we've got, I always have to read this out loud. At I Love Neil One Direction wanted to know which actor you think is sexier, Taylor Lautner or Josh Hutcherson. One starred as a love interest in the Twilight series, and the other one will star as a love interest in the Hunger Games series. So who do you love more? That was my life for about a year and a half. I remember we actually got a pretty large amount of traction with this. We had hundreds of thousands of users. We had millions of page views. And I distinctly remember calling a really good friend who's a VC, runs a fund up in Seattle that I'm invested in. And I called him and I said, Andy, you know, I've got hundreds of thousands of users and millions of page, tens of millions, I think, of page views. And I said, so, you know, where does that, you know, where does that put us? What, you know, where do we need to go from there? And all he did was laugh, and he said, Jon, if you can throw 2, maybe 3 zeros behind those numbers, then you have something that somebody else would be interested in. So we finally decided that we were going to get out of the social media for 13-year-old girl game, and non-compete ended, and I went back into insurance. So after that, what's interesting is some of the folks that I had building this or that media with me ended up being part of the core team that bought Hometown Quotes. In 2012, we'd actually started to build some technology for lead generation, and we took that technology, we bought Hometown Quotes in 2012, and then we essentially used the technology platform that we'd built as part of this or that, and kind of reimagine Hometown Quotes with some more modern technology. And so, little known fact, if you do business with Hometown Quotes, you might see on the contracts that the contract is actually with this or that Media Inc. And that's because of the site that we built before. And then from that, in 2016, we had an idea that folks with more money, folks that had $1 million homes, might also be shopping for insurance online. And from that, we built an agency for high net worth families buying insurance online called Kelly Klee. And so I went off and focused almost all my efforts on Kelly Klee, and left Todd Chappell and the team, the amazing management team there, to really focus on the lead generation side with Hometown Quotes. So that's the story. I hope, I hope the journey helped, and I hope you got something out of it. And definitely open for questions. Michael.
I got to take myself off of mute. I made the whole turn myself off mute mistake. Those are great stories. You know, we got one question here, and maybe you can sort of elaborate a little bit on it. But you know, when you sort of experience sort of maybe a failure of some sort, you know, what are the certain steps that you can take, or did you take every time that sort of occurred, or were they all the same, or were they different each time?
You know, that's a great question. I think it was different each time, and I hope that I learned something each time. You know, I think one of the major learnings that I had from the end of eCoverage was that, because at the end of eCoverage, it literally was just in, you know, it was in fight or flight mode. We were just trying to get by each week and make progress and try to get towards a sale. And so I think what I learned from that was that, you know, this too shall pass, that there's light at the other side of it, and that you know, the old, I think it was Churchill who said, if you're going through hell, keep going. That you just, you know, if you just keep going and keep moving forward, then you get to a better place and get to a solution. And so I think that was, you know, that was really a big thing there. And like I said, when we were in SureHits, as we were going through all these pivots and figuring out, well, gosh, you know, one of the things with the reason why it didn't work out, we couldn't replicate the GMAC insurance deal at SureHits, was we'd already had this amazing long-standing relationship with GMAC, so they let us put ads on their website. Then when we went to Esurance and Geico and Progressive and everybody else, they said, oh, that's an interesting idea. Let's get on with the legal team, the compliance team, the technology team, the, you know, and you get in contracts and talks and discussions forever. So the big difference there, though, is that we were making money, right? We were profitable. We weren't that profitable, but we were profitable. So we had the time to be able to try different things and see what was going to work. And then finally, with the with this or that, we were not making money. Let me just tell you, we were not making money. But it was a much more controlled experiment. I mean, for those of you who've read The Lean Startup, if you haven't, fantastic book. It was a controlled experiment. It was an amount of money that was affordable to mess around with social media. And so the other big difference is when it was clear that it wasn't going to work, I shut it down and went back to insurance where I know I can make money.
Yeah.
So that's
there's a couple other questions, and you just
Sure.
sort of touched on one, so I'll let you maybe elaborate. One was, after your experiences, are there any books or documentaries that you would recommend to watch? And obviously, the Lean Startup you mentioned as a book. Are there anything else that you're sort of reading or interested in today?
Oh wow, that's a great question. Huge recommendation. I almost feel like, by the way, I wrote a blog post. It's on the Kelly Klee site about curating your background. So this is actually my actual kind of curated background here. And one of them, by the way, is Wild Ride, which is the book about Uber, which I think is a super interesting story. Actually, the person who's been on my mind a lot lately is Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, and and many other books recently. He writes a lot about risk and about how what we call fat tail risk, how the risk of things that are really outside the norm, like the 2000 .com bubble and 9/11 and then 2008 and now the global pandemic. Taleb writes a lot about these extraordinary events. And so I think right now, checking out his writing, his Twitter feed, some of it's very math heavy, by the way, but some of it isn't, is kind of really timely right now.
Great. Another couple more questions here. This one's a 3-part question. It looks like, was SureHits more difficult to onboard buyers or affiliates? Let me read through all these. Actually,
Yep.
this one segment here.
I'm making notes, by the way.
What's
I'm making notes of the 3-part question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Was SureHits more difficult to onboard buyers or affiliates? Was it always on a CPC or both sides? If not on CPC for affiliates, how do you establish a CPA with various buyer prices?
Interesting. That's a great question. I love it. Okay, so I'm actually going to answer the second question first, which is, and actually that goes into the first question a little bit. So when we started SureHits, yes, it was always on a CPC basis. And the reaction we got, and this gets back into who was harder to onboard, the reaction we got from all of the advertisers was laughter. Literal, you're insane. We're never going to do that, laughter. That was the reaction we got. And a little bit of a version of, and I would say, well, you paid Google and Yahoo and Microsoft on the CPC basis. Why not us? And they said, as soon as you get as big as Google or Microsoft, you're like, as soon as you, and of course, we got bigger than everyone but Google. So it's kind of funny, but that was literally the action, laughter, absolute laughter. And so what we did was we said, look, unlike everything else out there, remember, I don't know if you know, there's all these pop-ups and stuff like that. That there's all this, and actually there was a major fraud push at the time, and a lot of our advertisers had gotten burned by it. And what it was is it was a toolbar plugin where if you type the word insurance, then you owned that word, and they would sell you insurance for $1,000 or whatever it was, and they'd say 1 million people had installed their toolbar, but they really hadn't, or it didn't matter, or whatever. So a lot of people had gotten burned by that. And so what I said was 2 things. One is there's a pause button on your account, and you can pause your account at any time. So literally, we're only as good as our last click. You can turn it off whenever you want. You can cancel whenever you want. Even if you've prepaid his money, you can turn it off whenever you want. And the second thing is I guarantee CPAs. I'd say, look, we'll help you bid, we'll help you figure it out. And if your CPA is over your goal, you turn it off, we'll refund you your money. So essentially, I kind of backed it into a CPA by guaranteeing that the CPA would be there. And I knew I could because it would work out. So it was very difficult to get advertisers on board in the beginning. Keep in mind, in the very beginning, we were using our own traffic from Next Insurance and from some other sources. Ultimately, so then once we got them on board, then we started getting our affiliates on board. That became really hard. And it was the whole thing of like, why should we pay your VIG? We can do this ourselves. Why should we give you a 30% margin on this, or whatever the margin was? We can do this ourselves. And then, so anybody who had any amount of tech resources whatsoever would try. They would try to do themselves. And then I'd say, why don't you split test it and see how you do, see how you get paid more. And then they'd like, how does this work? How do you pay us more even with your VIG? It's like, well, technology actually really helps. And so I hope that answers the first two questions. And actually the third question as well, which is, if you want to get paid on another basis, find a way to start with where the person is comfortable, maybe on a CPA basis, and then transition with a guarantee or a backup that makes them comfortable. And for me, one of my big things is, sorry to all the SaaS funded people out there, whenever I hear that there's a locked in contract for a certain amount of time, the degree of difficulty of doing a deal with me goes up by 100x.
Yeah, that makes sense. One last question. It's pretty general, but what is your advice to beginners in the lead gen space? So from a lead generation marketing standpoint, is there any advice that you can provide from your experience?
I have some advice. Google the four-way test, the rotary four-way test. That's my advice. And so a couple of them are in particular, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Think always about building value, right? And think of it as an ecosystem. And by the way, I'm gonna channel John Jones, my partner from SureHits, a little bit here, who always said, we do things that work for everybody. I'm actually kind of, by the way, he has an Oklahoma accent. So when I hear it in my head, it's an Oklahoma accent. He always said, do things that work for everybody. And so that means your business partners, your employees, the consumers, and advertisers, affiliates. Think about your whole ecosystem and make sure that it works for everybody, because the moment it doesn't, the whole thing falls apart and collapses. If it's any of those players, it doesn't work for them.
I think that's a great spot to end this session. I appreciate you spending the time telling the stories and providing some advice. If people have other questions or want to reach out to you, I'd love for you to share that information so they can. How would they get a hold of you?
Jon at Kelly.com, Jon at KellyKlee.com is my email address. Hit me up. And sometimes, I'm more available than others, but I read everything that gets emailed to me, and I respond to most everything.
Awesome. Well, Jon, thanks for being a part of Lead Generation Week, and we'll catch up with you later.
Thanks so much, Michael. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who joined in.
Take care.
Take care.